Welcome to Malifaux University. 108. Markers. A significant game mechanic in Malifaux is the use of markers to represent game objectives, events, and sometimes even terrain. Before you play a game of Malifaux, you'll need to have certain markers ready. In ordinary games, you won't have more than 5 of any marker other than maybe strategy markers, so you'll need to have 5 scheme markers, 5 remains markers, and maybe as many as 8 strategy markers, depending on the strategy you're playing. You'll also need any special markers your specific models may make or use. Many companies make engraved wood or plastic markers with faction logos and color schemes, and some players 3D print them. You can even make your own markers out of empty bases, but if you're looking to just get to the table and start playing, you can download and print a complete set of every marker and token in the game through our Patreon or in the Wargames Vault. Links are in the notes below. So, what is a marker? Unless otherwise specified, there are some common rules that all markers share. Naturally, if something on a model's stat card contradicts these rules or says something different, go with what's on the card. In essence, a marker is a 30mm base that has been labeled or marked for a specific purpose. Most markers do not count as terrain, and even though they have a physical presence on the table, your models can usually walk over and through them like the markers aren't even there. Regular markers are considered to be height 0, so there's virtually no situation where ordinary markers will block line of sight. The 2 essential types of markers mentioned before are scheme markers and remains markers. Scheme markers are most commonly made by a model taking the interact action during its activation, and this lets you place it just about anywhere within an inch of your model. They don't do anything in and of themselves, but you can usually use them to score victory points in the end phase of each turn, like the Detonate Charges scheme from Gaining Ground Season 0. If you have 2 scheme markers within 2 inches of enemy models, you can remove them both in the end phase to gain a victory point, and you can remove a 3rd scheme marker to gain a 2nd point. When you remove scheme markers like this, it does not require the interact action. You just do it. Your scheme markers should not be mistaken for any other type of marker, so if you're using simple bases and write the word scheme or remains on them, maybe paint the base rings different colors so they don't look like one another from across the table. Scheme markers will ideally represent your crew or faction in an interesting and thematic way. Jacob Lynch owns the Honeypot Casino, so these scheme markers have playing cards on them. The Dreamer is a psychopathic child, so these scheme markers have toy blocks on them. Use your imagination and have fun with making yours. Just remember that scheme markers have no height, and models need to be able to stand on them, so don't make them too fancy. A fun fact is that the faction logos on each box of models Wyrd sells can be cut out and used as perfectly sized scheme markers. Remains markers are made when a model is killed. When this happens, place the remains marker on the table within an inch of the model before you remove it from the table. Whether it's a scheme, remains, or other type of marker, there are certain restrictions about where you can put it. For starters, it cannot overlap models or impassable terrain. If the obsidian statue took the interact action to make a scheme marker within an inch of itself, it could not put it overlapping this building or this model. It would be fine here or here. Markers also must be supported at least 50%, just like models. If the obsidian statue wanted to make its scheme marker on top of this height 4 building, it could, because distance in Malifaux is measured only horizontally, but the marker would have to be at least 50% on the terrain. The Ten Thunders player would not be allowed to make the marker hanging off the edge so that it fell. In any case, if there is ever no legal place to make a marker, you just don't make it. Some models and crews will make or remove scheme or remains markers as part of their actions or abilities for reasons other than scoring victory points or showing where a model was killed. From the 2-player starter box, the Ampersand crew's Repair Bay crew card gives all the Ampersand models in the crew the One Robot's Trash ability, which lets them remove a nearby remains marker to gain a positive modifier to an opposed duel. Now, this ability would be pretty pointless if you had to wait for models to be killed in order to use it, so some members of the crew, like BucketBot, have actions and triggers that make remains markers without anyone having to die. Similarly, the Rising Tide crew card for the banished models in the box lets banished models remove a nearby scheme marker to impose a negative modifier on an enemy model's flip when it resists the Neverborn attack. Just like BucketBot can make remains markers, several banished models can also make scheme markers through triggers and actions other than interact. This is a good time to remind you that you won't have more than 5 friendly markers of a type on the table at one time, with the possible exception of strategy markers. Let's say you're getting really beat up in a game, and 5 of your models have been killed. When your 6th model is killed, you'll have to remove one of your current remains markers before you can put the new one down. You get to choose which one, but not removing one and saying you choose the new one is not an option. Pick one up and use it as the new remains marker. The same goes for scheme markers. If you already have 5 on the table, you have to remove one if you want to make another, and you get to choose any one you want from anywhere on the table. This also applies if you make these markers in special ways, like the ampersand and banished models do. If Urchin wants to make a scheme marker with his obscene ritual, but there are already 5 Neverborn scheme markers on the table, he'll have to remove one to put this new one down. It doesn't matter how many enemy scheme markers are in play, this restriction applies only to friendly markers. And while we're talking about removing markers, let's understand that markers usually do not move horizontally once they're placed on the table. They will move vertically, however. If there's a scheme marker or some other marker on a piece of terrain, like a destructible crate, that is removed, the marker falls straight down, just like a model. We'll discuss markers that count as terrain in a minute, but if you put one of these markers, like a hazardous shadow layer marker or the Clampet's severe and concealing tide markers, on top of another terrain marker, you just stack them as is. If you put these terrain markers on top of a non-terrain marker, like a scheme marker, you move the scheme marker on top of the terrain marker. Stacking markers like this may affect line of sight depending on their placement and base sizes, but we'll discuss that in another video. As far as removing markers goes, just about any model can take the interact action to make or remove a scheme marker within an inch of itself, but interact does nothing to remains markers. In any case, a model cannot target a marker with the interact action if there's an enemy model in contact with the marker. If the obsidian statue wanted to remove a scheme marker, it would not be allowed to remove this one since the showgirl is standing partially on it and is therefore in base contact. It could remove this one since no enemy model is touching it. One more fun rule about most markers is that you can ignore the terrain traits and other special effects of friendly markers. This doesn't apply to the height trait or to strategy markers, but since impassable, hazardous, severe, and traits like these are all terrain traits, other members of Zip's infamous crew can pretend his piano markers aren't even there when moving or drawing line of sight, as long as they don't try to end a movement overlapping one. If Masaki Katanaka needed to draw line of sight across one of her own crew's concealing shadow markers, she could ignore that trait and draw line of sight without penalty. This makes the game much easier to play without having to meticulously plan the placement of your markers to minimize interfering with your own models. I'll take a brief moment now to thank all those who were patrons at the time this video was made, especially Mats by Mars, Sergey, Tom, Alan, Jason, Jeremy, Mikulai, Oleg, Tomas, and Travis, and many more at the free student tier. Your support is essential to bringing these videos to life. Now we get to strategy markers. Just like your scheme markers and remains markers should look distinct from one another and from your opponent's markers, the strategy markers also should be clearly marked and not mistaken for other markers on the table. Again, you can get easy-to-print scheme, remains, and strategy markers from the link to Wargames Vault in the notes below or by joining our Patreon. Strategy markers, like most other markers, are on 30mm bases. You'll often place them during the setup of the game, but some strategies will have you place or remove them during the game. Informants from Gaining Ground Season 0, for instance, has the players place 3 strategy markers on the center line, then each player places one on their half of the table. Recover Evidence, on the other hand, starts off with just 2 strategy markers, one on each half of the table. Killing models makes more strategy markers during the game, and then models collect the strategy markers to score points. As more strategies come out each year, you'll see more creative ways that strategy markers are used, but they all have some common rules. While they otherwise behave mostly like other markers, strategy markers generally are immune to anything models do. The only way to manipulate or affect strategy markers is normally whatever is printed on the strategy card itself. Recover Evidence says a model may remove a friendly strategy marker with the interact action. Since it doesn't say anything about removing enemy strategy markers, you can't do it. If your model has a game effect that says to target a nearby marker, strategy markers do not count. If Harold Tull, artillerist, wanted to use his launch into space tactical action, he could use it to remove this ski marker or even this remains marker, but not the strategy marker. You can usually walk over strategy markers, but your models cannot stop standing on or overlapping the strategy marker. If there's a strategy that has strategy markers with the impassable trait, it'll say so on the card. Some strategy markers will move, like in Boundary Dispute, where the objective is to move your friendly strategy markers onto the enemy half of the table. This movement is really a place where you pick the marker up and put it down, so as long as it's not overlapping a model or impassable terrain where you set it down, you're good to go. The last type of marker, terrain markers, really has 2 categories. There are markers that count as terrain, and then there are special terrain markers. The former are far more common than the latter, so let's address them in that order. A marker counts as terrain if it has any traits of terrain. Captain Zip's piano markers are height 3, blocking, and impassable. Height, blocking, and impassable are all traits of terrain, so piano markers count as terrain. Any game effect that says to target a piece of terrain can target any marker that has any terrain traits. If your crew uses unusual markers like these, they will be listed on your crew card so you can prepare them before your first game. The other type, special terrain markers, have their own stat cards and often do not really count as markers. Be sure to read the stat card carefully. You either put these on the table while you're setting up the game, just make sure both players have agreed to use them, or they are made by specific models during the game. The 2025 Christmas Waldo is a piece of special terrain. Chugga Chugga Waldo is on a 50mm base, is height 1, and has the blocking trait. There are special rules for how to play with this piece of terrain, but it does not actually count as a marker. If it were a marker, the stat card would refer to it as a marker and not as a terrain piece. Markers and terrain like this clearly add a level of complexity beginning players may not be ready for, so add these into your game only when you are both comfortable with the rules and your models. That's the overview of markers. Pick up a printable set of all the markers and tokens you need to play Malifaux in the Wargames Vault. If you haven't already, join our Patreon for early, ad-free access to all new long-form content. And be sure to visit the Malifaux University gift shop for the latest in Malifaux-themed shirts, hoodies, drinkware, and more. Links are in the notes below. And remember, play friendly games, keep it simple, and have fun.